I see there's already people in the chat, so sorry, I'm a bit late getting going, but some IT shit to sort out. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna do it a bit different to last time. We're gonna keep going with going through Richard Carrier's blog. Also, shout in the chat if everything's coming through all right, if you can hear me okay. Slightly different angle on the camera today, so you can see my dog in the background. Wilma, Wilma, you're on YouTube. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I've made some slides, but they're not going to be that great. I've been making them and haven't really had a chance to sort of finesse them, so I might have forgotten stuff and left stuff out or whatever. But I think instead of just reading from his blog and responding to it, I thought I would try and do it a bit more systematically by making some slides and going through them. So let's get them on the go. Wherever they are. Why can I not see that? God damn it. Give me a second. I have a presentation just sat there. Why can't I? Okay, here we go. So I'm just going to sort of go through this as I don't know. Let's just see what happens, right? So first bit, we talked about this a little bit before. Also, cheers. So part one of this bit, I'm going to talk about what Carrier says about the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity. So he says this. We sort of looked at this last time around. He says, but these laws have been shown to all just be different formulations of the same thing. The law of identity, e.g. A, is simply a different way of stating the law of non-contradiction. A cannot also be not A. So all three laws of logic are different ways of saying the same thing. So this is one of his central claims. And since last week, I got this book, which is Principle of Contradiction in Aristotle, a critical study by this Polish logician Jan Łukasiewicz. So he's a philosophical logician, a historian of logic, a philosopher in general from like the early half of the 20th century. This is a book that he wrote when he was a young man of 30, and it's published in 1910 in Polish, admittedly, but then translated into English, I think in 1973, and then there's this new version of it that's come out, I think in 2010. So this is like a seminal work in the history of logic, in the sense that it's published in 1910. So if you know anything about the history of logic, that's around the time that the kind of Frege bombshell of modern logic is really exploding amongst logicians, and people like Łukasiewicz are sort of early adopters of the new sort of mathematical logical methodology, and he's applying that to stuff in logic and philosophy in general. He's a pioneer of like thinking about modern logic in its early days, and he has this sort of provocative takedown of Aristotle, and in particular on the law of non-contradiction, and whether Aristotle like successfully defends it and what his arguments are and stuff. And so it's like a really detailed sort of analysis of what Aristotle's up to, and it's a great place to go to read more about this. So I recommend the book highly, Principle of Contradiction in Aristotle by Łukasiewicz. So that's spelled Lukassiewicz. Difficult to spell if you're not familiar with Polish words, and even if you are, it's kind of difficult to spell. So I'm gonna quote some stuff from Łukasiewicz I found out when I read this just like over the last week. I had no idea actually that it was going to be quite, but in this specific context, it's going to be quite so on point because he actually considers basically this point that Carrie is making, which the way he's describing it is that like there are logicians who say that the law of identity is kind of like the positive side of the law of non-contradiction, so that they're like two sides of the same coin, and that's basically what Carrier is saying here. So let's see what Yukasevich says about that. So he says, it is surprising how strongly certain opinions can persist within the sciences that are not only incorrectly formulated and without justification, but which are plainly false. Most likely, as I believe, because what has been declared in the past is repeated uncritically again and again. The problem of the relation of the principle of contradiction to the principle of identity presents itself in the same manner. So if you're not used to reading how people write in like 1910, this is a savage burn. So he is he's dishing out ponage on this. So he's basically castigating the previous generation of logicians who were fumbling around without the mathematical rigor that modern logic has provided, and dissing them because he's saying that they just like repeat stuff and they don't understand it. Okay, so there's simple cussing or whatever that's going on here, but the actual content of what he's saying, I mean, in my own words, to be fair, is on the next slide. So why isn't the law of identity saying the same thing as the law of non-contradiction? And the short answer is the law of non-contradiction is about propositions, whereas the law of identity is about referring terms. Right, so the slightly longer answer is like, given the precision with which the principles can be formulated in modern logic, right, it's clear that the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity operate at different syntactic levels. Right, propositional logic doesn't have any, so this is like a way of like justifying that claim. Propositional logic, I mean, I don't think you need to justify that claim, it's obvious when you look at it, but look, consider this, propositional logic doesn't have any referring terms and no identity symbol, right? It just doesn't have that. It's too simple a logic to have the notion of identity or referring terms. Yet it does have the principle of non-contradiction, like classical propositional logic. You can prove that for any proposition P, it's not the case that P and not P. So you've got the logic, you've got the principle of non-contradiction, but you can't even express the law of identity. And that is a big red flashing flag that's saying, flashing flag? It's a big red light, big red flag, whatever. It's a warning sign because it's making you think, hold on, how could it be that they say the same thing and if they're synonyms of each other? But in this context, I can't even formulate one of them, but I can formulate the other one, right? How come, right? And the reason that you can't is because it just operates at a different level of syntax, right? So what we're talking about here with this formulation here, what we think of as a principle of non-contradiction, right? Saying not the case that P, this is some propositional variable, so it stands for some truth-bearing proposition, right? P and not P. So you can't have both a proposition that's true and its negation at the same time, right? So we're relating propositions to one another. But just look down here at the next one, the law of identity. For all x, x equals x. Right here, now this x, the reason I'm using different variable means convention anyway, but the reason I'm using these different variables along with the normal way of writing this out is that this is an expression that you would see in first order logic where you've got a domain of objects that you quantify over and you talk about them being in different sets and that means that they have different properties, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that like it's this whole expressive set of resources that gets introduced when you sort of graduate your logic from propositional logic into first order logic. You start saying, okay, now it's propositional logic, but we also have, you know, constants like terms that refer rigidly to specific entities in the domain. We've got quantifiers like this upside down A for all x, right? X equals x. These are new terms that we didn't have in propositional logic, and they allow us to refer to like objects and things, whatever our domain of reference is about. And so we can formulate, and like strictly speaking, for all x, x equals x, that is a proposition, right? That's the sort of thing that could be true or it could be false. So it's the sort of thing that could be a P in this law of non-contradiction above. So you can see that like that's what I mean about it being at a lower level of syntax is that like this is structure inside a propositional variable. This is what a propositional variable might be in this upper formulation. Whereas this is something that takes those types of things and then relates them. It says something about them. It's saying you can't have things like that and negation signs in front of that at the same time. Right? Whereas this thing is talking about objects, and it is itself a proposition. So it's like once you actually look at logic and how it actually works, instead of just like imagining how it might work, and I'm not, I'm throwing shade specifically at Richard Carrier, but like in people in general, not doing any logic, or when they do logic, they're doing it super informally, just reading some fallacies handbook or something, instead of actually looking at the real practice of mathematical logic. They're not going to know that this is like basically a big blunder to say this. It's a sort of category mistake to confuse those two types of things, right? So I'm hammering this home because like it's it's what the point of this is, that like familiarity with the actual details of logic helps clear up what otherwise seems like sort of persistent philosophical misunderstanding. Um, so here, Yukasevich wraps up this section by saying, from this, it emerges that the conception articulated by many logicians that the principle of identity is merely a positive formulation of the principle of contradiction makes no sense at all. Right? No wonder none of them has bothered to present this assertion correctly and to further justify it in some form. Even with respect to the most fundamental logical problems, empty phrases are still strewn into the wind. Right? So this is, I think, yeah, drop some shades down on him, because this is really about as savage a bun as you get from like a logician in 1910. But he's basically saying it's just a complete misunderstanding. Like pre-modern logic was not able to clearly articulate this properly, but now we've got modern logic. We can see this just makes no sense. And people who say this don't know what they're talking about, is basically what he's saying. Anyway, so here's Yukasevich. He's saying what I'm saying, basically. And I didn't know that he actually considered this idea that non-contradiction is just a form of the principle of identity. But he did, and he completely demolished it and gave these savage burns as well. Okay, so let's kind of recap, because I did say some of this stuff last time around, although I didn't have like nice pictures and funny quotes from Yukasevich to back me up. But now I do, so hopefully it points even more, it lands even more obviously. So let's move on to the next thing. So, I've called this one of Aristotle's arguments for the law of non-contradiction. I call it one off because it depends how you read the relevant passage in like book 4 of the Metaphysics. What I think of as being the kind of like normal interpretive kind of consensus is that Aristotle tries to present what they call the big argument, which is like a load of bunch of what we can think of as paragraphs now. It sort of runs on, and it keeps going on more or less the same point. And then there's a bunch of sort of scattergun of like other arguments that come later on, well, immediately after following that. There's a bunch of paragraphs that seem like standalone, distinct arguments. So it's not just that there's one argument that's made. There's a bunch, and there are varying qualities. And I mean, fair enough. I mean, you can get super detailed into this. It's also true that Aristotle doesn't just give one version of the principle of non-contradiction. He gives at least 3, and one of them being something like, for all substances, if a substance has a property, then it can't also lack that property. And then there's another one which is just like, for all statements, if this statement is true, it can't also be false. And like, they're not the same thing. One of them's restricted to, it's like a metaphysical claim about substances. The other one's more like a logical claim about truth and sentences. And you know what, I should probably, I've been going through this. I haven't actually checked that I'm sharing my screen. I haven't looked at the, let me just, because it would be a huge blunder if, am I sharing my screen quickly in chat? I think I am. I can see the chat. And it's yeah. Okay, cool. So where was I? Right. So Yeah, Aristotle gives different arguments for different principles, right? Another principle, a version of the principle of non-contradiction he sometimes gives is about more like a kind of psychological or epistemic sense, where it's like it's impossible to believe both P, that an object is P and an object is not P or something. Um, and so you can think of it as like a grade of like the psychological version of principle of non-contradiction, the metaphysical version, and the logical version. And I'm putting them in those orders because I think that the arguments for the psychological one are just like laughably bad, right? It's just obviously true that you can imagine two contradictory propositions at the same time, and it's not even that difficult to imagine believing two contradictory propositions at the same time, because even nothing follows from that. It doesn't really matter, right? But just consider the fact that like everybody's, unless you're perfectly rational and you've got everything sorted out, you almost certainly believe right now, even implicitly, two propositions or one proposition and its negation. You know, you probably do. The process of rationally sort of pruning your beliefs to try and make them more consistent only really makes sense if the set of beliefs in the first place isn't already completely consistent. So someone might point out to you, for instance, like well, you believe this, but over here, here's an argument that shows you're committed to the negation of that. And when those types of that's like a kind of ad hominem argument in the sense that like you're showing that somebody's beliefs are inconsistent. And sometimes when those sorts of arguments work, the person on the receiving end of that has to revise their beliefs, let's say, so that they drop one of them and just accept the other one, removing the contradiction. Um, but before they've decided which one to drop, they're still in the doxastic state of believing both of them, right? So, um, yeah, so this sort of thing happens every day. So, like the idea that you can't possibly believe a contradiction, two propositions, like a proposition and its direct negation. The idea that you can't believe a proposition and its direct negation just seems like obviously not the case, right? The real game in town is like, is some version of the metaphysical principle or the logical principle right? And that's what we're trying to sort of figure out. Anyway, and that's what Aristotle's sort of like unfortunately quite careless between switching from talking sort of ontologically about like things that exist and then talking like logically or semantically about like things that being statements being true and false. Sometimes he just like switcheroos them without any warning, and it can be really confusing if you think that he's trying to say something different. I think most commentators just think that he hadn't distinguished those two things very well, so he flips between them without meaning anything in particular that's different. So sometimes, there's a case to be made that he's not really trying to say two different things between the logical and the metaphysical principle, but yeah, whatever. They are different when you look at them, and now we do tend to distinguish those. So um, we should certainly treat them differently. Anyway, so what's coming up here is Carrie doesn't like get into any of that, which is fine because I mean this is sort of like Aristotle deep dive Aristotle stuff at that point. So whatever, fine. You have to read some secondary literature to pick up that there are these nuances in play. It's a little bit unfortunate because what he does is quotes a bit of Aristotle, but it's like basically out of context, and the way he talks about it makes me think that he's not reading the standard commentators and interpreters of Aristotle, because it sort of sounds a bit like it's just plonked out of nowhere. Anyway, he gives this bit. I'm not okay. Boom. Right. So he quotes this, and okay, I'll just read it out. Again, if all contradictory predications of the same subject at the same time are true, clearly all things will be one. For if it's equally possible either to affirm or deny anything of anything, the same thing will be a trireme and a wall and a man, which is necessarily follows for those who hold the theory of Protagoras. For if anyone thinks that a man is not a trireme, he is clearly not a trireme, but he's also a trireme if the contradictory statement is true. So the result is the dictum of Anaxagoras: all things are mixed together so that nothing truly exists. Um, I actually chucked this quote in because there's like the way Aristotle is translated, it differs, and there's lots of ambiguity. I mean, the Metaphysics is a book that's not exactly like written by Aristotle. I mean, it's like basically people think that it's more or less kind of like lecture notes that were taken by someone else whilst he was teaching. and then maybe edited and sort of picked together later on, but it doesn't read in the same way. The details of exactly how they come to that conclusion escape me, but there, it's a book that's got all sorts of like wiggle room for wondering how to translate it and how to understand it. So this is a famous passage, and I didn't exactly recognize this translation, so I chucked it into Google to see if I could find it, and I couldn't. So I wonder if what that means is that Carrier has translated it himself, because don't know, but given his status as a historian of this period, sort of this Greco-Roman period, maybe he reads Greek and he just did his own translation, which would be cool if he did. So anyway, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the translation, at least nothing that I'm qualified to be able to say. I can't read Greek or ancient Greek. But whatever. So there's this basic idea. Here's the idea, and it's supposed to be an argument against, an argument for non-contradiction. It's a bit obscure if you just read this passage, what's going on. And I think, like I said, it helps to put it into the wider context of what was going on in that part of the metaphysics and how this is like part of the big argument and blah, 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 whatever. So let's just park all of that stuff. Let's just see. This is what Richard Carrier puts. Hold on a second. Why don't you get in the bed? Yeah. Come on. You get in that bed. It's dark. All right. Here's what Carrier says about this. He says, you might not immediately follow what he's saying here, but it's actually quite profound. As Aristotle explains, any posit we make asserts that something exists, while a negation asserts that it does not. So to assert both is to declare literally nothing. That is, a self-contradiction communicates nothing and represents nothing, even in the mind of one who wishes to declare it. So the way I'm understanding what's going on here is that he's giving his interpretation of what Aristotle's doing in that argument. So it's like a reconstruction of what the argument is supposed to be doing, I think. Either way, he's putting forwards, whether he's saying he's getting it from Aristotle, he does seem to be saying that he's getting this from Aristotle, one way or the other. He's putting forwards this idea that that contradictions like don't mean anything, they don't communicate anything at all, and that's some kind of reason for thinking that the law of non-contradiction must be true. Okay, I'm skipping over some. I mean, he emphasizes that this is something to do with physics or whatever, but it doesn't even matter because we're going to kind of present reasons to be dubious of this that undercut that part of the claim anyway. Firstly, just think about this. Is it true that contradictions don't mean anything? Well, here we can go back to Yukasevich again. When talking about things like contradictory objects like a married bachelor or a round square or something, he says, some consider these strange combination of words as empty, meaningless sounds, which is basically what Carrier was just saying then, that they don't communicate anything, they're meaningless. As far as I'm concerned, I think they're not merely empty sounds like abracadabra or mahatra, but that they still mean something. After all, one can assert about a round square that it's round, that it's square, and that it's a contradictory object. Whereas one cannot assert anything about abracadabra because this literally does not mean anything. Right? So what he's saying is that just the simple idea that contradictions don't communicate anything whatsoever just doesn't seem right. Like a contradictory object, you want to say something like, if somebody was to say, well, what's a round square like? You wouldn't go, oh, you've literally communicated nothing to me, right? You could say, well, it's a contradictory object. It's supposed to be both round and square. I mean, there are true things you can say about it, even if you think that it's false and necessarily false, right? Well, necessarily impossible. There could be such an impossible object, right? So it just doesn't seem right that they communicate nothing. And here's another example. We'll come back to this a bit later on as well, but just suppose there's some hypothetical community somewhere with a legal system, right? So they have a body that meets and votes on making new legislation, like a House of Representatives or a Parliament or something, and that this hypothetical community is kind of careless in their record keeping. So one year they vote that anybody over the age of 16 is allowed to participate in the general election that's coming up. But then a few months later, absent-mindedly, they also passed the law which says that nobody under the age of 18 can participate in the general election that's coming up. So now what's happened is that there's two contradictory statements of what people are allowed to do. Because if you're 17 and you sit in between those two thresholds, then it's just true that you are allowed to participate in the upcoming general election because of the first law, but it's false that you're allowed to participate in the general election because of the second law. So the two laws just overlap with each other, leaving a situation which is just inconsistent. So, I mean, I've just told you a story there, which actually seems to me could happen. I don't know any reason, I don't know, anything I said then was impossible. A careless legislature, it's not impossible, right? And so if that's the case, and it's just like, you know, a contradiction now emerges, whether it's like deeply ontological, or whether it's kind of like constructed and the legal system is in such a way that it's, you know, blah, blah, blah. Still, it's both true and in its negation is true, let's say, that you can, a 17-year-old can vote in the upcoming election. But it seems to me that like it's very hard to maintain the idea that like I just communicated literally nothing with that example. Like the example seems certainly to be something that I communicated, right? Whatever meaning is, whatever your exact theory of meaning is, feels to me like that's the sort of thing that's going to meet the bar for most theories of what counts as meaningful. I mean, and the short way of putting it is just that like, if something is false, like a contradiction is on the classical view, if something's false, then it's meaningful, right? Like, as Yukasevich is saying here, abracadabra isn't even false because it's meaningless, right? Everything meaningful, no, everything, what do I want to say? Everything that's not got a truth value on this classical view would be meaningless, right? Is that right? No, even that's not right, because I could say something like shut the door, right? That's meaningful, but it doesn't have a truth value. But so everything that has a truth value is meaningful. I think that's the right way around to put it. So if something's true, it's meaningful, and if something's false, it's meaningful. Like you've asserted enough to be able to determine that it's false, for instance. So it's not completely meaningless, right? You have asserted something, even if the output is that it's false by definition or something, that's still meaningful. So I just think that it's just wrong to suppose the contradiction meaning is meaningless, right? So I think in here I think we can just safely side with Yukasevich again on this one. So Carrier has another go, and this is the real like mistake that I wanted to zoom in on mostly about this, because it's going to give me the opportunity to talk about something I find interesting anyway, and it seems to me it's actually the most serious mistake so far that I've read in this blog post. So this is just under that paragraph where he says communication would be impossible. He puts what seems to me a different argument, which is that all distinctions depend on the law of non-contradiction, right? So maybe he means this to be the same argument, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But let's think about this one now. It's on the screen. So I'm going to read this big quote out. He says, "For if everything is true, then there's only one thing. In other words, there's no difference between one object and another. In fact, there would then be no objects, exactly as Protagoras concluded. But to be an object requires distinction from something else. And distinction is literally what we mean by a non-contradiction. A distinction is the literal, physical, descriptive opposite of a contradiction. Therefore follows that in any universe where distinct objects and properties exist, where distinctions exist of any kind, no self-contradictory propositions will be true of that universe." And he references a bit of Aristotle there, but anyway. So what it means to say that no contradictions obtain is simply that distinctions obtain. Every world and every state of being in which distinctions exist is thereby already being described as a world or state conforming to the law of non-contradiction, because that law is simply saying distinctions exist, therefore it therefore is the description of all distinction states. So it's just like he's basically saying, well, if you want to be able to distinguish one thing from another, you need to have the law of non-contradiction. Otherwise, it's just everything's just all sort of mixed together, and there is no distinguishing one thing from another, right? If everything is true is the very first, is the antecedent here, right? For if everything is true, then there's only one thing. Okay, so hopefully the general idea of where he's going with that is clear. Now, let's see what Yukasevich says about this. So uh, he says, and this is him responding to, obviously not to Richard Carrier, but responding to the same passage in Aristotle, although it's Yukasevich's translation there. But he says, perplexing is the expression all contradictory statements. Why all? Whoever doubts this principle of contradiction, I don't know why he calls it the principle of contradiction or the principle of non-contradiction, but it's the same thing. Whoever doubts the principle of contradiction, and especially whoever demands a proof for it, does not have to assume that all contradictory statements are simultaneously true. The opponent of the principle of contradiction considers whether at least one case can be found in which even one pair of contradictory statements is true. Apologies for my typing on this. It's, as I said, I was making this quickly. Because this single case would already be sufficient to bring down this principle. In response, Aristotle shows him that anybody who was to assume that all contradictory statements were simultaneously true would arrive at a nonsensical conclusion. This may be so, but conducting a proof in such a manner is similar to fighting windmills. Right, so is another savage burn. Have we got another glasses meme? No. Okay, I forgot to do it now. But like the point here is that let's go back to Aristotle again, right? He's here, at least in this Carrier. But this is in all of them, right? Again, if all contradictory predications of the same subject and the same time are true, clearly all things will be one, right? But just think of that, right? It's not just saying suppose there's some contradiction somewhere. It's saying suppose all contradictory predications of the same subject at the same time are true. That is to suppose that all contradictions are true. But of course, that's like a scope distinction, because what's at stake isn't whether all contradictions are true, it's whether no contradictions are true. And to dispute the claim that no contradictions are true, all you need to do is say that at least one contradiction is true. You don't have to kind of swing all the way to the exact opposite and say all contradictions are true, right? There's space in the middle between them. So the point is that like it's a straw man. This is why Yukasevich says it's like fighting with windmills, because it's like not a real opponent. I mean, like, at least I assume that's what that metaphor means. I don't really know what that metaphor means, but to me, it's him saying that this is a straw man. And the point is that like, well, Aristotle is just like targeting the wrong opponent, right? How is Aristotle making such an obvious blunder? Well, um, this may be that this is one of those kind of the person writing it down made the blunder themselves. They were trying to listen to Aristotle and write it down, and I don't know, it was never edited properly afterwards. I don't know. Maybe that's what's going on here. Yukasevich thinks that Aristotle is kind of like increasingly desperate at this point in the dialectic, trying to, thrashing around, trying to find anything that will work as an argument, right? After all the things he's trying to suggest are obviously insufficient, and it is just desperation and kind of like arrogance or something at the same time. So Yukasevich just thinks this is just like game over, basically. But regardless of how Aristotle comes to it, Carrier just reads this passage unaware, seemingly, of the kind of, and this is kind of like normal, straightforward thing you'll read in loads of commentators, that this idea of there being a distinction between all contradictions and some here, and in this place is a scope distinction that Aristotle sort of gets wrong. That's quite normal observation to make, but whatever reason he has for doing it, he simply adopts the fallacy and runs with it. So the rest of what he's saying here in this bit, he's saying, oh, if everything is true, there's only one thing. In other words, there's no difference between one object and another. I mean, like, cool, but so what? What's that got to do with whether the principle of non-contradiction is true? That's just like to argue against the person who says that all contradictions are true. Right, so let's look at that distinction in a bit more detail. Let's go like make this super explicit. So this is Yukasevich just basically pointing out the scope distinction fallacy that's going on there. But let's spell it out in more detail, right? So here, let's distinguish these two things. So first of all, dialetheism, right? So this is just the claim that some contradictions are true, right? So And there's a picture of Graham Priest in the corner there. He's going to come on the show in September and talk more about this type of thing. But you know, some of the sorts of things you might think as examples of dialetheia or true contradictions might be, you know, the liar sentence, this sentence is false. You might say that the example of the Trinity in Christian theology is an inconsistent thing that constitutes a contradiction. I talked about the example of inconsistent legal systems earlier on, where it just so happens that careless legislature passes two inconsistent laws at the same time. This example, Bohr's theory of the atom, apparently was shown to be inconsistent. I might have to get Dan or Phil or someone to explain that one to me, but apparently that's true. Apparently also it's true of Newton's laws of physics as well, that they constitute a contradictory system. Anyway, so there's this other example Yukasevich comes up with, which is this thing, a square constructed with the aid of a compass and a ruler whose surface area is identical to the surface area of a circle that has radius 1. That apparently was an outstanding logical problem that was proved to be unsolvable in the 19th century, and Yukasevich refers back to that. His point there is that, like, many mathematicians didn't realize that it was going to be impossible, of course, before the proof existed. So they were taking that description of a square that you could construct to be, you know, at least on paper, it looks like it's the sort of thing that could in fact be made. But a bit like crossing the bridges of Königsberg, it was just proven that there isn't going to be a way of doing that. It's actually impossible. So it, you know, it's another sort of inconsistent description. So that might constitute like a contradictory abstract object or something, right? Anyway, so you get examples like that. But key to this idea, and we'll look at it in a bit more detail in a minute, is the idea that you're just going to, like, for metaphysical or other sort of general theory choice reasons, you might at some point be willing to consider that something is contradictory, for instance, a liar sentence or something. You might just go, look, all these attempts at rescuing set theory from the paradoxes is just doomed for like revenge phenomena coming back all the time. And the easiest thing to do is just to say, well, no, there is just an inconsistency. It just is a true contradiction or something, right? But key crucial thing in this is that although there are some of these kind of like head-scratching examples that you might stop and ponder, the dialetheist isn't committed to the idea that every contradiction is true. They just think, like, what about this thing, or what about this thing over there, or whatever. So it's clear, it's the claim that some contradictions are true. Let's contrast that with trivialism, right? This is the claim that all propositions are true, which, if you think about it, also means that all contradictions are true. So the trivialist is going to say things like P is true, and they're going to say not P is true. They're going to say P is false is true, and P and not P is true. Not P and not P is true, right? Not P and not P is false is true. They'll say a man is a trireme and a man is not a trireme. They'll say all is one, and they'll say all is not one, right? So, I mean, in a way, there's what Carrier was saying, if we go back to this, right? If everything is true, then there's only one thing. That's the first kind of conditional up here. I mean, in a way, that's true, because, like, for a trivialist, they're gonna, like, agree. If you say, is there only one thing? They're gonna say yes. It's just that if you ask them, is there not only one thing? They're gonna say yes to that too. They're just gonna say yes to whatever, any question you ask them, they'll say yes to. So, I mean, in a way, if everything is true, then there's only one thing, but it's not, you know, because of, on this view, we're assuming trivialism, like all inferences on trivialism, is trivial, right? Nothing strongly implies anything. Everything just trivially implies everything. So if everything is true, then there's only one thing is right. But if everything is true, then there's not only one thing is also right. If everything is true, then Richard Carrier is a sausage is true. And if everything is true, then it's not the case that Richard Carrier is a sausage, right? All of these statements are true. So it's like, it's technically right, but it doesn't signify anything, it doesn't mean anything. Because the whole hypothesis of if everything is true, then, like, it infects even this. You don't even get to say everything is one, or there's no distinctions or something. Like, if trivialism is true, then there are no distinctions. But also, if trivialism is true, then there are distinctions, right? Because everything is true on trivialism. So the trivialist is a funny character. Like, I've got this underneath here, Aristotle saying, your view is contradictory, and the trivialist is going, that's true, lols, also it's false. right? Like he's they don't play the rules by the rules of the game. They just do their own thing, and yeah. So I guess it's just crucial to distinguish, right, the trivialist from the dialetheist, and that if there was a target for, let's go back again, this passage of Aristotle, because he's saying if all contradictory predications, the key word there being all, right, then that just means he's actually got the trivialist in mind, not the dialetheist. And Richard Carrier picks it up and keeps going on that line because he's saying if everything is true, that means if all contradictions are true, or if every proposition is true, right, if all propositions are true. So he's just using the same, he's just making the same uh, quantifier scope fallacy. And like this is the one where I was saying, you could be a diehard Richard Carrier fan and disagree with me about whatever you want to, but like, how are you going to disagree on this one? Clearly, clearly, Aristotle is using all contradictory predication. He's using the universal all, and clearly, so is Richard Carrier here. He's not criticizing Aristotle. He thinks Aristotle's making a good argument, and he's amplifying it. But the thing is, Aristotle's making a terrible argument, and Richard Carrier is just following him down the dead end, right? That's obviously what's going on. And I'd be amazed if there was some like rescue strategy which shows that me and Yukasevich and the whole history of 20th century logic is wrong, and Richard Carrier parroting these like 19th century myths about how logic works and seemingly just surface reading Aristotle without any reference to any of the secondary literature or any of the commentary is right. Like I just think how are you gonna say that? I'm not saying like I'm always right. I'm definitely not always right. But here I've done my research. We're looking at the actual like the detail and it's clear. It's just black and white clear. He's making a blunder because Aristotle makes the blunder and he blunderously just follows along. So this just seemed to me the most obvious um, thing to complain about with this. I only got a little bit more. Maybe I'm racing through. I don't know. So we here what I'm putting here is that we can sort of see that if trivialism were true, then there would be no logical distinctions, right? Everything is true. There's no like this is true, but you know the negation of that's not also true. But everything is just kind of the same. It's just like logic doesn't really make any distinctions there. But if dialetheism were true, this is just not right. Like you don't get to say there's no distinctions just because some contradiction is true. Um, right? And here's the most obvious way of putting this scope distinction fallacy, right? So just because one contradiction is true, that doesn't mean that they're all true. And that's just the slide that you need to do in order for Aristotle's argument to even get going in the first place, right? So the idea that you need the law of non-contradiction to think that, in Richard Carrier's words, distinctions exist is based on this quantifier shift fallacy. So it's wrong because it's based on a fallacy, an obvious one where he's using all instead of some. Why is that a fallacy? Let's just think about it. The original claim, what's the claim? The law of non-contradiction says there are no contradictions, right? For everything, it's not a contradiction. To prove that, so that's like me saying, for every swan, it's white, right? To prove that statement wrong, I don't need to show that, in fact, every swan is black. I only need to show that one swan is black to disprove the claim that every swan is white. And it's the same thing here. If the claim is no contradictions are true, you can undermine that claim just by showing that one contradiction is true, right? You don't need to show that every contradiction is true. So like throwing shade at the person who says that every contradiction is true is funny, but it's just irrelevant because that's not rebutting the argument. That's like saying the person who, here's my claim, all swans are white. How am I going to defend that? I'm going to say that people who think that all swans are black are idiots because, whatever. But disparaging the person who says all swans are black doesn't actually establish that all swans are white. What you need to do is undermine the claim that at least one swan is black. And that's harder to do because it's a more specific claim. It doesn't have the, it's just a different claim, basically. I think arguably like it's which opponent is harder to fight against, the dialetheist or the trivialist? I mean, in some ways, the trivialist is impossible to fight against because he doesn't he'll concede everything you want, but also like nothing really sticks to him. You can't really pin him on anything. So it's not clear, like he doesn't really accept, I mean, he will accept, of course, every consequence of every argument, but like precisely because he's not making any distinctions between anything, it's cheap and it's easy to get him to agree to anything, and none of it really matters. So like, in a way, the challenge that the trivialist proposes to classical logic is so deep and profound. It sort of escapes the edges of the chessboard, and in that way, it's like hard to checkmate him, right? Because he's like not even playing the game properly. So in a way, like the trivialist is like the target of this argument. It's the wrong target, but also it's not even clear that you could score a point really in a meaningful way against that person. So it sort of misses the target in the sense that it's not an objection against a dialetheist, but then it sort of accidentally, like friendly fire or something, hits the trivialist, and you think, oh no, what about the trivialist? He's just got hit with this argument. But actually, trivialist just gets up again because this argument doesn't really mean anything to him, because no arguments really mean anything to him. So it's like not even it's just sort of like it doesn't do anything on any level, this argument. Um, all right, one last little bit. Let's look at a little bit at some paradoxical logic, right? So Graham Priest publishes this paper in 1979 called The Logic of Paradox, right? Or sometimes just called LP. The system is called LP. Um, and I'm really just explaining this to give a sense of like what does it mean if you were to do logic but without the classical assumptions. Like here's just one version of that anyway. So on this theory, you still have two truth values, right? So technically, it's like a bivalent theory. There's only true or false, right? There are no gaps. There's no third value. But what we do is we just allow that a proposition can be both true and false, right? So it can be mixed. So in that sense, then we've got three kind of states that a proposition could be in. Even though there's only two truth values, it can occupy three states, right? Because it could be true only, it could be false only, or it could be like in a mixed state of being both true and false. So that's the interpretation of this. And actually, all that's going on is I mean, broadly speaking, anyway, the definitions of the connectives and the kind of logic that you get out of it is just the same as actually a logic that Yukasevich came up with, three-valued logic, which was codified by this mathematician called Kleene in the 50s. So technically what's going on here is that this is a strong Kleene table, three-valued logic, but it's just interpreted where the third value is a mixed state. So it's not even a particularly groundbreaking way of setting things up. What Priest is doing is sort of using that to show how it could be thought of as a logic of paradox. And like the interesting thing is that once you open your mind to the idea that like there could be a paradox, a statement that's both true and false dealt with in a logical way, this is sort of just helpful to go through and see what the consequences of it would be. But look, I just want to do a tiny bit of the detail of this. So like look down in the left hand corner, I've got the truth table for negation on this logic, right? So you like one of the things that goes wrong sometimes with these arguments is that like people will say, look, the law of non-contradiction has to be true because the definition of negation is, if P is true, then not P is false. So there's no way that there's no gap between them for it to be both true and false or something, right? But you know, if you're going to seriously entertain some hypothesis like the law of non-contradiction might not be true, you do have to sort of do a bit more work than just that. You have to like understand how to modify logic in such a way that it like takes that on board. Like just like if you were to remove Euclid's fifth postulate about parallel lines, right? You have to do a bit more to construct a sort of non-trivial geometry that comes out of the other side of that. So this is a bit like Riemann doing non-Euclidean geometry. This is Priest doing non-Aristotelian logic, right? So anyway, in the definition of not here, it's basically like, when P is true, not P is false. Okay, that's normal. And when P is false, and when I say false, I mean, and true and false here, I mean true only and false only, right? If P is true only, then not P is false only. If P is false only, then not P is true only. So like on the sort of edges of the mixed bit, where the propositions themselves just have normal classical truth values, then the behavior is classical. It's just that where they don't, then the behavior starts to be different. So the definition of not here in the middle, I've put B for both. So like if P is in the mixed state of both true and false, then not P is also in the mixed state of being not of both true and false, right? And let's just move on to the definition of and in here. So the basic way to think about this is it's kind of continuous with the classical way of looking at it, right? What and means is you can think about it as like being just the minimum, right? So what I mean by that is just think about like true and false in classical logic being like true is 1 and false is 0. Now, the classical account of what and means, of P and Q, is just, it's going to take the minimum value. So if either of them is 0, the whole thing is 0, right? If they're both 0, the whole thing is 0. It's only going to be 1, as in true, if they're both true, if P and Q are both true. So it's just like a minimum truth value connector. That's how it works. And now over here, it's the same thing, but because we've got 3, so maybe we think of true only as being 1, mixed being like a half or something, and false being 0. And in that sense, the and truth table just is still the minimum. It's still the same idea as we had in the first place, because like if you look at what's going on here is that like when P and Q are both true, then P and Q as a whole is true, right? But otherwise it takes the minimum value. So if one of them is mixed, the truth value of P and Q is mixed. If one of them is false, the truth value of the whole thing is false. So it's always going to take the minimum value, whatever that is, but we've just shown how we could introduce a sort of middle ground in between them. And all we need is those two to start seeing how the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold in this theory, because here on this one, right, if we look at the top row of the negation truth table, where P is true, then the truth, true only, then the truth value of not P is false only. So where P is true, not P is true only, not P is going to be false only, and that just means we take the minimum value from that, which is false, right? So that the top left corner is false. And so basically the only difference between the P and not P truth table is that top left corner, which is false instead of true, right? So basically it's false in every situation, just like the classical one, except those where at least one of the values is both, right? So those middle 3, which are the new rows because of the introduction of the third truth value. So what the point is that just like where there is a paradoxical proposition, you might find that the behavior of the connectives and the kind of compositional semantics is different from how it is in classical logic. But where the propositions are well behaved and normal, it's just classical logic again. So it's like you can think of classical logic as being a fragment of this logic, which is larger and contains those classical ideas in it as a smaller part. Anyway, I just think this is interesting to sort of see if you've never seen any of this type of thing before, and you're always scratching your head going, oh yeah, but it doesn't proposition blah 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 work like this and non-contradiction work like that. Here's the beginnings of how you can start working through what it would be like differently. So I think a little bit more, 1 or 2 more slides, is that of course you're gonna have to do a bit more as well, like maybe it just follows already from what we've said, but the notion of validity in paradoxical logic has to be slightly different, right? Because of course, if you had the rule that's put on here, explosion, right? Premise 1, some contradiction P and not P. The rule of explosion says that you're allowed to derive any arbitrary proposition from that contradiction. So what that means is that like if that was true, then dialetheism would immediately give rise to trivialism. Right? There wouldn't be any difference between a dialetheist and a trivialist, because dialetheist just says, oh, maybe there's some contradiction. But if you keep hold of explosion, there being one contradiction just actually means you can derive every true proposition, or you can derive any proposition. So you could derive any arbitrary number of other contradictions. So it would just be that like you're not really containing the paradoxicality somehow. It's like leaks out and takes over, and you're just left with trivialism again. So for a dialetheist who wants to kind of keep keep a distance between them and trivialism, one of the things you're going to have to do is reject this principle of explosion. Um, and actually, arguably it's not really that far back in the history of philosophy anyway. I think it only goes back to something like 16th or 17th century, kind of Renaissance uh, idea that is not necessarily there in earlier kind of classical logicians, like actual classical antiquity logicians. So anyway, it's just something that you're obviously going to have to reject. That technically speaking, rejecting explosion means that it's going to be paraconsistent. That's just what the definition of paraconsistency is. Um, it also follows, given the definition of the connectives that we just looked at, that you're not going to have reductio ad absurdum, disjunctive syllogism, or double negation elimination as rules as well. And I mean, there are other rules. The idea that there is these like named rules or whatever is a bit artificial, but like, there's a whole chunk of what would normally be valid inferences that are not going to remain valid, because sometimes there's going to be cases where there's mixed values getting in the way and blocking the truth preserving nature of the inference. Not always, but sometimes, right? And uh, so you're gonna have to revise your logic a bit, but it's not completely incomprehensible. It's not like nobody's ever thought about this before. It's reasonably well documented. And in his book in contradiction, Priest talks about how you've kind of like what you've got left over with this type of system is something you can call pseudo validity. It's like valid when it comes to the classical cases. It's just normal classical validity. It's just like for a restricted set of all of the propositions, you've still got classicality. So what you might think is that there's this philosopher J.C. Beale who has a book called Spandrels of Truth, where he articulates this idea that there might be contradictions, but they're like always going to just be sort of semantic in nature and not ontological. So they're going to be like out products of your semantic theories, but they never concern statements about things that concretely exist. Those types of statements are always classical. So on his view, he's got a kind of principled reason for drawing a distinction between the realm of where you might find a contradiction and the realm where you wouldn't. And that's a kind of metaphysical bulwark that prevents, or at least gives you some reason for these types of changes. So he could say something like, listen, whenever we're doing reasoning like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, that sort of thing is going to be classical, because when we're talking about expressions like Socrates is a man, that's talking about concrete things that actually exist, and those things behave classically. It's only when you're talking about things like this sentence is false, or whatever, these kind of set theoretic paradoxes, or something like that, something semantic or abstract in nature, that's where you might find a limited range of contradictions. Or Priest also has this cool book, Beyond the Limits of Thought, where he traces out how, one way of looking at it, there's potentially there are contradictions that kind of emerge like as you creep up towards like the edge of your cognitive capacities, when a thought really starts to break down under its own assumptions or whatever, blah blah, and then maybe you find that then you start to encounter some contradictions. But it's not like saying, oh, I might just bump into something that's both like a watch and not a watch, or something at the same time. um anyway, so you there's this idea that like it just sort of jumping on the bandwagon of Aristotle and saying, "Oh yeah, it's a thing about law of non-contradiction is true because if all contradictions were true, then there'd be no distinctions." It's just like, what's going on with that? That's just missing. It's missing all of this work, all of this like super interesting way of thinking about. Like he mentioned paraconsistency once in the paper, at least as far as I read, and it was just to throw shade at it. He didn't engage with it in any way, and all his engagement there was that if you're a paraconsistent logician, then you're just gonna find that you use Aristotelian terms and concepts anyway, or something. Like I said, I think the best version of that argument is that you're gonna be saying that the sort of meta language, the language I express, for instance, the semantic clauses and stuff in my for my logic, they're going to be just like English phrases. They're not like in a formal language. I'm saying something like, look, this negation sign means, not P means P is false or something, and when I say P is false, that's just a token expression from English. And then you might be trying to say, well, look, English is classical, even if you can cook up a kind of artificial three-valued or paraconsistent or paradoxical logic. Still, you're going to have to state it in the classical logic of English. I think that's the best version of that argument, and still, it seems to me quite weak because, like, it's not clear that I am using English as classic, as that English is classical in that way. Maybe it is. Maybe English is paraconsistent. I mean, there's some people who think that the English language is not very well modeled by classical logic. There's all sorts of well-known reasons why the material conditional just doesn't seem to track what most people mean when they say if this then that, and yet that's part of classical logic too. So you might already think that relevance logic or something is the one true logic anyway. So maybe I'm stating my metalogical semantical clauses in natural language, which is itself a relevance logic or paraconsistent logic or something. And the point is that, like, what I'm trying to say is that with these logics, they overlap with classical logic, and you could think that they overlap substantially, right? That the border, the edges where there's inconsistencies are quite far removed from most of the stuff that we're actually reasoning about day to day. So, like, strictly speaking, it's not clear that my English language actually is one is classical or non-classical, because if either way round it would overlap. It would behave exactly the same way for most of it. It's a bit like Gödel shows that there are non-provable arithmetical statements, but that doesn't mean that humdrum counting of like 3 eggs and 3 eggs makes 6 eggs or something. It doesn't mean that that's not going to be provable. Something's not provable, but it's going to be whatever it is. It's going to be like divorced quite a lot from humdrum arithmetical statements, which, as far as I understand it, they're all just basically normal. You can still prove regular things in arithmetic. It's just there's a kind of limit to the extent of everything being provable. And you could say there's something similar here, that like maybe the principle of non-contradiction isn't strictly speaking true, but it's just true enough. It's true in most cases, right? So it doesn't really get in the way. It doesn't mean, for instance, that there's no distinction between anything. If all the propositions in the argument take a whole truth value, like all true or all false, then the whole thing is just classical logic again. It's just that you can't even tell that you're in a non-classical logic. So, last thing, this is another thing. I mean, this isn't really Richard Carrier. This is more like Jay Dyer, where he tries to argue that. I mean, maybe I'll do another. Maybe I'll do a whole thing on him at one point. But like, could you use a reductio ad absurdum argument against the trivialist or the dialetheist? And no, basically, is the answer to this. No. So just imagine this argument. Premise one is like either trivialism or dialetheism is the case. Then premise two, it follows from either of them being true that there is at least one contradiction. And then you could say, well, I've assumed something. Underneath that, I've derived a contradiction from it. So the reductio ad absurdum inference rule allows me to deduce that the original assumption must be false, right? Because it leads to a contradiction. Now, it might already be clear that this is question begging in this context, but let's just pad it out a bit. The reductio ad absurdum rule is actually just a rule that allows you to not write out a specific premise in an inference, I think. But effectively, it's just a shorthand, effectively, because it's just a modus tollens, right? It's just, imagine this: if trivialism or dialetheism, then some contradiction P and not P is true. Premise two would be, well, it's not the case that P and not P, right? That then allows you to reason via modus tollens that the antecedent is false. Okay, someone is phoning me on Discord. That's really great timing. Give me a second. Whoever the fuck this is. That is Nathan, so maybe he's trying to tell me. Christ. I hope he's not going to try and tell me that I'm not sharing my slides. I think he is though, isn't he? Fuck, we might have to do this again another day. All right, let me just see what Nathan's saying. My slides aren't showing properly, for fuck's sake. Cool. Well, hopefully this wasn't a complete waste of time. I will come out of this mode and see what's going on in the chat. I can always go back and revisit something if I need to. So let me stop sharing my screen. Okay. I hope that it's not just loads of people saying my slides aren't working and this was a waste of time. All right, someone tell me in the chat, has this been useful? Have you actually managed to see anything, or has it completely been not working? Well, okay. So, is there any questions about anything now? Now I finished not doing. Oh, it's been stuck on slide 2 the whole time, has it? Fuck. Oh man. Well, I guess what I might do then is just like record a version of this offline and go through the slides and make sure that it's actually showing properly. So yeah, okay. So people are saying, can you see the truth table? Yeah, well, yeah, let's try and do that. Yeah, like this motherfucking slide here. God damn, it's just that it doesn't show. Maybe it's because it's in full screen mode. It doesn't show whether it's screen sharing or not. So I had all these cool slides. Did you miss this bit? So I made Yukasevich wear cool sunglasses because he was being a boss in that. Okay, the truth table for the hopefully this is coming through now, and guess I'm gonna have to come in here and grab this. Okay, so here's the truth value. Here's the truth tables that I had in mind. So I just put up the truth table for negation. So that's where P is true, not P is false, where P is both, not P is both, when P is false, not P is true. And then here was me trying to say the AND connective just takes the lowest value. So where P and Q are both true, then it's true. But if either of them is both, well, basically, if either of them is both and the other one's true, it's both. If any of them are false, it takes false, right? So it's the same idea as conjunction in classical logic, because you just say that truth dominates. So we prioritize true. We call true like 1 and false 0, and then you can think of it as being an ordering like that. And as I said, then the mixed value is something like a half, and it sits in between them in terms of the ordering. But if you think about it like that, then it's basically the same idea of and. It's just that and is like taking the minimum value. And then once we've got these two definitions in hand, we can formulate the principle of non-contradiction here. And what you'll see is that like where P is true, then not P is false. So that makes the whole thing false. If P is true and not P is false only, then this thing is then and is just classical. If P is mixed, then we know from this table over here that not P is also going to be mixed. And we know that when they're both mixed, then P and Q is also mixed. So, and that's the counterexample, right? Which is that like, if you allow for these mixed states, then that means that you can have, you can construct P and not P, but it's not true. Sorry, it's not false. It's mixed, right? So what I was saying is that like, if you notice, every square in this matrix is false except for the ones where one of the two sides is both, in which case the whole thing becomes both. And that's why it's not always false, right? Sometimes it's like not false, it's both true and false. But it's a counterexample to the idea that an expression like this is always true, or true by definition. Okay, so Nathan says, why doesn't carrier include the Sheffer stroke as a primitive connective? I mean, that would be good if he did. So the Sheffer stroke is this idea, goes back to a logician early 20th century who was trying to write ever more compact and efficient ways of axiomatizing propositional logic. So instead of having a negation and a conjunction as primitive and defining the others based off them, he managed to make it so there's just one connective, which is primitive, and you define all the others off that. I guess I don't know if Rich Carey is familiar enough with the nuances of that to know about it. Would have been a bit obscure if he did. Okay, any other questions? If not, I'm going to go and make some dinner. I'm just scrolling back up to see if there's anything. I really should have checked. I thought the slides were good. I think what I did was I went to see if you could see the slides and then just didn't. I don't know what I did actually. It was still screen sharing. I don't know. Yeah, there are many valued logics. Is this an example of that? Kind of. It depends exactly what you mean by many valued. I mean, it has two truth values, just like classical logic does, but it allows you to mix them together. And that means that there's three states, even if there's maybe only two truth values, there's three states here. I mean, it's kind of a question of interpretation. So you know, like I said, that this is just a Yukasevich or Kleene table, but given a different interpretation. So yeah, there's loads of different ways of doing that. So there's another question here. Is P and not P ever just true? No, not on this logic. That's right. You do have, so what you have here is P can be both true and false. But you can't, I think if I'm understanding it right, you can't like show, there's no circumstance where P and not P, that statement is true. What you get is that it's not the case that P and not P is always false. And that's what makes it a counterexample to the law of non-contradiction. And yeah, so there's another question here, which is, do I still prefer classical logic? I mean, I don't know if I prefer it or not. Sure, that's the right way of thinking about it. Maybe I you know, as a rule of thumb, I'm going to just do classical logic unless something comes along and makes me think about this. But like I said, the point of this is that it's not supposed to be so revisionary that like trivialism is the case. It's still supposed to have areas of classicality where you can just keep going doing normal classical logic anyway. So I mean, even if you're paraconsistent logic, you're still going to do classical logic like 9 to 5 kind of thing. Maybe just do paradoxical logic on the weekends or something. Okay. Any new developments on the presup bubble? Not sure what the presup bubble means in particular. I was chatting to someone about doing a debate on presup, but I need to nudge them. They've gone cold, so maybe they've changed their mind. Maybe they're scared of the ponage, but probably not. Yeah, so there's a really interesting one here. Have you checked out Beale on dialetheism for the Trinity and Incarnation? And no, but I'm aware of this. So J.C. Beale's got a book, I think, called Our Contradictory Christ or something like that, where he defends this view that that I think the Trinity is a contradiction. So up here on this slide you didn't see, when I was introducing dialetheism, I gave some examples, and like the second one in here I gave was the Trinity, because I was thinking, yeah, you know, it prima facie looks contradictory or inconsistent, but also I was thinking, yeah, J.C. Beale's been defending that. I haven't read the book though, but I think it's super interesting. I mean, maybe I'll message him and see if he wants to come on and explain it. But I've never met him, so I don't know him. If anyone does, let me know, and blah blah blah. So, do I think Priest's answer to the revenge problem works? Um, I don't know off the top of my head what Priest's answer to the revenge problem is, but the revenge problem is that, like, the solutions, typical solutions to the liar paradox, where is you like, I think, for instance, if you try and say, oh, there's just the liar sentence is neither true nor false, then you can reconstruct the paradox again with it being that the sentence is both true and not true, and then it just doesn't seem like it helps at all. So point is, with revenge, you try and postulate some way out of the puzzle, but what you do is end up kind of moving the puzzle somewhere else and not really doing anything to help it. So I don't know if that's, maybe that just is what Priest's idea was with that. I don't know. I might have to go back and have another little look at that. What else have we got? A load of questions today, which is great. Yeah, okay, here's another cool question. I've heard that there are some logics that won't allow introducing irrelevant terms and avoid explosion that way. Yes, absolutely, that's relevance logic. So that's like one of these problems people grumbled about early on with classical logic, was that, like, the material conditional doesn't seem very realistic. Like, you can have propositions where the antecedent of the conditional and the consequent have nothing to do with each other. Like, if I'm a tomato, then the moon is made of green cheese or something. And all you need to do is just, like, assign the antecedent and the consequent a truth value, and then you can calculate what the conditional means. But it seems like that sort of, we don't use the conditional in that way when we talk in natural language. In fact, what we should be doing is, like, there has to be something in common between the antecedent and the consequent. Well, I guess it's between the premises and the conclusion. There has to be some common term that's shared between all of the premises, which otherwise it just, like, doesn't count. So it's like classical logic, but it's like a sort of fragment of that, because it's saying, you know, forget all these ones where you've got inferences or implications where the antecedent and consequent, or the premises and the conclusion, whichever way around it is, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, where they have no connection to each other. And what we have to do to, you know, characterize that logic properly is have something in common between them, and that's relevant logic. And that was developed by people like Belknap back in the 50s, I think, and 60s. And if I'm understanding the history of that right, that's what led people to consider paraconsistency in the first place, which is what paved the ground, and the logical work that was done on that paved the ground for people like Priest and Beale to come along later and start going, oh, well, what if there actually are contradictions, whatever. So it wasn't primarily motivated by this metaphysics, this kind of contradictory metaphysics stuff, which, you know, and people like Priest and Garfield, it's like sometimes informed by Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and stuff, but it doesn't have to be. Like, the people like Belknap were just sort of straight down the line, just normal logicians, just like trying to make logic better, and that's what they came up with relevance logic for. So yeah, there's some good history there. Okay, I'm going to go on to a couple more of these. Let's see. So I don't really know what this made by Jim Bob is doing 20 atheism versus him on Discord. So somebody is spoofing what's he called? Jubilee, which I'm not sure sounds that great, to be honest. Maybe it does. But I'm going to stop sharing because I'm not actually sharing my screen anymore, and I'm just looking down as well. So this, I don't know why this has become a sort of stock phrase of mine when I'm like ridiculing supposed implications of dialetheism that hamburgers eat people. But I think this is gonna like it has become, maybe it's already a meme or something. Um, so obviously I'm not saying that. uh, was it C.I. Lewis that first developed modal logic? Yes, not to be confused with C.S. Lewis, who is the apologist and whatever Narnia books author. C.I. Lewis was a logician, again, grumbling about primarily things like material conditional being weird, um, and that made he wanted to come up with a kind of strict conditional that didn't have those problems in, and that meant that he started going, well, you know, you can, there's loads of different varieties of strictness that you could come up with, and it axiomatized loads of different systems. I think S1 through like 9 or 12 or something, and S5 is the one that people know. That's where the complexity of all the different ramifications sort of just collapse down and the system's really simple. And then it grows and becomes more complex again. So S1 and 2 are kind of complex. S4 is quite neat. S5 is super ultra neat, like a crystal or something. And then it starts getting like more and more complicated again. But yeah, that's true. Made by Jim Bob's argument is a tree can be true or false. Is can a tree be true or false? I mean, the guy sounds like an idiot, to be honest. So, um, is that good? No, probably not. Uh, okay, right, cool. All right, so sorry about the mix-up. Fuck's sake. Thanks, Nathan, for trying to help. I mean, you were about 50 minutes late with phoning me. So it's your fault, but also it's my fault because I guess I'm a trivialist. Anyway, like I said, I'll try and record a standalone version of that so you can see it as I intended, I guess. Um, Hugh McColl developed modal logic before C.I. Lewis. Okay, that's probably true. I don't think he came up with all of the different systems that Lewis did, and I know McColl was a pioneer in logic. I don't actually know much about what he did, but yeah, okay, cool. All right, good. I think I'm going to call it a day there. Again, sorry about that. Like I said, I'll record a standalone video going through the slides and we can all just forget that this happened. Bonus, though, you got a dog inclusion. Hello. All right, good. Thanks for your time, everyone. We'll see you again with the next one. I'm not sure. Should I do more on Richard Carrier or should we move on to something else? Let me know. I guess if you like this content and my shitty ability to share my screen and stuff, then smash that subscribe button. um, yeah, all right. You called me earlier on Facebook. Well, I don't have Facebook open, so you should have known that somehow. Anyway, cool. Thanks very much, everyone. See you later.